Hi, and welcome to Unit 2. So while in Unit 1 we focused on Socrates and Plato and Socratic thought, which is kind of the bedrock of Western philosophy, in this unit we're going to focus on ethics and philosophical anthropology. And what we mean by that is the branch of philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom and ethics, that focuses on what are the things we ought to do and ought to be, and what are the consequences we ought to seek in order um, that we may have a happy and virtuous life. So that word ought to, not what we are required to by law, but what we ought to do. Now, hopefully, good law is rooted in ethics. This is more of a moral question, and you're going to probably see a lot of congruencies or similarities with some of the ethical thought of the Abrahamic traditions, Judeo-Christian values, because they're really based off of Aristotle's thought. And that's why we start this unit with Aristotle. He's kind of the father of modern ethics. So who is Aristotle? Well, oftentimes when people think of the great Western philosophers, the Greek philosophers, they think of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Mainly because Aristotle was a part of Plato's school of thought. So he's born around 384 BC. His parents died when he's young. He's originally from Macedonia. And so he moves to Athens in order to join Plato's Academy of Thought. So Plato is running a school of thought. Remember, during the Socratic time, people would seek out wise individuals like the sophists to be taught. Plato is in the similar mindset. So is Socrates. The difference is they're not falling into the same traps as the sophists. But Plato does create this Academy of Thought to continue really Socrates' work, so to speak. And so Aristotle now spends the next 20 years studying under Plato, first as a student and then as a colleague, another philosopher. While he studied under Plato and continued a lot of the same thought from Plato and Socrates, he does disagree with Plato on a lot of key points. In particular, he disagrees with them on the theory of forms. Remember the theory of forms, that there are ultimate forms, such as like beauty and courage and truth, which we can try to attain by theoretical knowledge through a theory of recollection, through the right questioning, tapping this information to be able to get out of the cave. Remember that image of seeking the forms by getting out of our perceptions into reality, and then we can ultimately attain these ultimate versions of beauty and goodness that we can only perceive in the visible world. Instead, Aristotle opts for metaphysics. So while he rejects Plato's theory of forms, Aristotle's response to understanding the nature of being was metaphysics. And while Plato saw a difference between the intelligible world, which is made up of thoughts and ideas, and the sensible world, made up of what could visibly be seen, and believed the intelligible world was the only true form of reality, Aristotle believed separating the two would remove all meaning. Instead, Aristotle believed the world was made up of substances that could either be form or matter or both, and that intelligibility was present in all things and beings. So again, rather than these forms and these different worlds, Aristotle focuses on everything has a form and a matter. Aristotle's Metaphysics is composed of 14 books that were later grouped together by editors. It's considered to be one of the greatest works ever produced on the subject of philosophy, with Aristotle believing that knowledge was made up of specific truths that people gain from experience, as well as the truths that arise from science and art. Wisdom, as opposed to knowledge, is when one understands the fundamental principles that govern all things. These are the most general truths, and then translates this information into scientific expertise. So you can kind of see with his view of metaphysics, the grounding of what we're going to discuss in a little bit of his virtue ethics theory. This idea of that there's these general truths, but then these greater truths. And then we can fully understand greater truths and how to apply them. So when we talk about scientific expertise, the science of virtue, so to speak, knowing how to apply them, then we've really gained wisdom. So if we're going to see philosophy as a pursuit of wisdom, for Aristotle in ethics, as a branch of philosophy, we've attained that pursuit when not only have we attained the greatest good, but we are properly disposed and know how to apply them regularly. And that's how we've attained philosophical wisdom, the quest of truth. Well, it wasn't all rosy for Aristotle since he was originally from Macedonia. When Alexander the Great, the ancient great Macedonian conqueror, died in Greece, there was a certain hesitation to anyone who was from Macedonia, or distrust would be a better way to put it. So rather than die like Socrates, Aristotle fled to the island of Euboea, where he died in 322 BC. And so, really, Aristotle gives us a wealth of philosophical wisdom, not only in ethics and metaphysics, but also in logic, these are going to be two topics, metaphysics and logic, that we're going to see in later modules in different units. But for now, let's focus on his ethics. So his main work, his most famous work, which is part of which you're going to be reading for this module, is Nicomachean Ethics, which takes the name from his son, Nicomachus, because we believe that he might have very well been a key editor in this work. However, all of Aristotle's key ideas are still remaining intact here. And we're going to find that, especially in book 1, so there's 3 books that we'll discuss in this module in a very general way. But in his first book, it's going to focus on happiness, or attaining the greatest good. So just as Socrates might have thought in the theory of forms that there are these ultimate forms, well, Aristotle didn't see the world in that way. He still kept a similar premise in that there's this ultimate good. This ultimate good that everything in the universe, in our lives, every action is somehow ordered to. And the good is the end of a means. So the means being our actions, the way we live our lives, our choices, should all be geared towards reaching this end of the good. So you think of goods with a small g, whenever we refer to the good, it's a capital G, the ultimate good. And for Aristotle, the highest good is happiness, which makes pretty good sense to us as humans, that if we boil down everything we do, it kind of boils down to how can I be happy? And if you think back to the conversations that Socrates had with Meno and Protagoras, it's seeking after similar things, seeking after virtue, courage, ultimately this idea of honor and happiness. It's very Greek in its thinking of how do I live the examined life, the happy life, the fulfilled life. So you can see that throughout Greek philosophy, this idea of seeking happiness, this ultimate good, this idea is really kind of key to understanding the bedrock of Western philosophy. It's also later on, St. Thomas Aquinas, who we're going to explore in the next module, he draws very heavily from Aristotle. And so when he talks about the moral life, it's going to start with how does the human person be happy? And now for Aquinas, he's going to orient it to God. Aristotle is simply seeking happiness for happiness' sake. It's kind of devoid of this ultimate idea of the Christian God, mainly because, remember, in Greek society, there's this belief in many deities. Aristotle notes this connection, but also differentiation between the good and pleasure. So he has a whole section in a later book devoted to pleasure. And while he doesn't necessarily see pleasure as a bad thing, and that it's even a part of attaining happiness, there is a difference between being happy and being filled with pleasure. And we'll talk about that in a second. He also notes that different demographics of people see the good in different ways. So political, or the cultivated class, quote unquote, according to Aristotle. The political individuals will see the good as honor, early virtue and general. Again, remember Meno, remember Protagoras, seeking honor, virtue, courage. That was very big in the political sphere. Going to war was seen as a very honorable and courageous thing. That's what the ultimate good is. Remember the whole back and forth in Protagoras, where Socrates keeps going on about what courage is and isn't, and can we actually choose it? Is it rational? There's going to be a lot of similarities here with what Aristotle is talking about with the good, that ultimately virtue is rational, that we choose it, and that the difference between happiness and pleasure is rational, choosing it. Well, while all these individuals might see the good as honor or virtue or courage, philosophers like Aristotle are going to see the good as wisdom or truth, the seeking of truth. That's really it. The whole purpose of philosophy is the quest for wisdom. So, above anything else, the good is the seeking of and attaining of wisdom. In particular, in ethics, the wisdom that helps us to know how to live a truly happy life, to attain that highest good of happiness. Uh, Unlike Plato, so again, there are differences between Aristotle. He doesn't agree in the theory of forms. He believes in metaphysics instead. And unlike Plato, he doesn't think that there's one transcendent good, but many particular goods. So there's an ultimate good, happiness, and then there are particular goods that can kind of help us to get there. So what are these types of good, these particular goods that Aristotle believed in? So there's three: external goods, goods of the soul, and goods of the body. So you can see too, and this is his metaphysics coming into play of form and matter, body and soul, where he talks about goods in the same way. So goods of the soul are the highest goods of transcendent goods. They are when the means of an action are good unto themselves. So means and ends. So ends is the ultimate goal. Means is the way you attain that goal. So the ultimate end is happiness. The means which we get there, he talks about as the goods of the soul. So sometimes individuals in trying to get to a good end will do bad things, bad means to get there. And then we'll see Aquinas' famous phrase, the ends don't justify the means. And that's where he gets into morality. Aristotle doesn't get into that right now, but it's good enough to know that there are means and there are ends. Sometimes people choose bad means to get to a good ends. What Aristotle says is, hopefully, we are choosing good means to get to a good end and avoiding bad means to get to a bad end. And so when we're able to choose good means, actions that are good unto themselves to reach that good end, these good means he calls the goods of the soul. External goods are resources that serve as a good end. So external goods help us, can be a good end unto themselves, but hopefully can build upon one another to get to the ultimate end of happiness. Goods of the body serve one's physical condition or appearance, so that hopefully we're staying healthy. So if you think of goods of the soul having to do with the rational mind and the spirit, goods of the body have to do with upkeeping, well, our body. And so all these different things that help us to be happy through health, through wisdom, are going to ultimately end up helping us attaining the ultimate good of happiness. Because I like to think, or I think that Aristotle would think, that if we have healthy mind, healthy body, form, matter, then we have an ultimately happy life. Not all goods are complete, and the higher the good, the more complete. So the higher in this ranking, so goods of the soul would be considered the most complete. Happiness is most complete since it's chosen for its own sake. It's the highest good. So when we talk about goods of the soul being when the means in and of itself is good, everyone is choosing happiness for happiness' sake. For instance, we might choose to study to be able to get a good grade. And that's a good mean, but you might not choose to study for the sake of studying. You might only choose to study in order to, again, get a good grade. That's your ultimate goal. Now, if you study for the sake of study, that's good and virtuous. But that would be different than say, well, if I would say, do you want to be happy? You would say, of course. And you wouldn't have any other thought. And you would choose to be happy for the sake of being happy, while you might not choose to study for the sake of studying. I don't know, it's just an example. Maybe you do. I'm not trying to pass any judgment on that by a point, but just an example. Well, the difference. So since happiness is simply chosen for its own sake, where people just want to be happy for the sake of being happy, it is the highest and ultimate good. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between happiness and pleasure. So Aristotle thinks that happiness is to be found by living according to our nature and fulfilling what it means to be human. So ultimately, when we are our truest self, we are living life to the full, that's how we attain happiness. The question is understanding what is life to the full. Well, for Aristotle, he's going to go on and say it entails a life lived according to a certain plan or strategy that is furnished by reason. This is going to be the main difference between happiness and pleasure. Happiness is the highest good. Pleasure isn't necessarily bad, can be good, but it's not stable. In other words, you eat a really delicious meal, the meal is ultimately going to be over, and eventually you're going to be hungry again. So you experience the pleasure of food, of tasty food for a period of time, but eventually you're going to crave it again. You remember Plato's tripartite soul, the desire, the belly, right? The three parts of the soul, the reason, the spirit, and our desire. You're going to desire that tasty food again. So pleasure isn't continuous. Happiness, if we're actually able to attain true happiness and live a happy life, or the way Socrates would put it, an examined life of meaning. Think of it this way. When you have meaning in your life, when you have purpose in your life, when you wake up every morning and you're glad to be alive, you know what you're doing with your life. You know, you don't question like, what am I doing in my life? What's the point to all of this? You're happy with what your life is. That's like a state of being. That's very different than like that food tasted good and I like tastiness. Or like I went on that date or I went on that roller coaster ride and it was like so good. But now it's over. Happiness is more of this constant state of like, I don't want to say contentment, but just happiness, enjoyment of your life, meaning and purpose. You can kind of see why happiness is this is really different than pleasure now. Like really what we mean by happiness a lot of times as humans is we really mean pleasure. Like that felt good. That was a good experience. And we talk about it in terms of happiness. And this is where pleasure is connected to happiness because pleasure can lead to happiness. Pleasure gives us a small taste of ultimate happiness. But pleasure ultimately is not fully happiness. If you think back to Introduction to Theology, the difference between imperfect and perfect happiness. Imperfect comes and goes, perfect happiness lasts. That might be a good way of looking at it too. Imperfect happiness is pleasure, perfect happiness is happiness. Uh, that's why a lot of times as humans, we spend a lot of time seeking for happiness and not getting it and trying to fulfill it with all these other things that are really just pleasure. And we're not able to find a way to string those things together to create a stable life of happiness. That's what Aristotle says that we have to do. That's in part for Aristotle the point of ethics is figuring out a strategy, figuring out steps rationally using reason, not just doing things because they feel good, but thinking it through, using our reason to try to figure out how to be happy. What pleasurable things, healthy body, good eating, studying good content, things that are going to be both pleasurable but that are going to lead us to ultimate happiness, as opposed to other things that might give passing pleasure in the moment, but really are a bad means into themselves that are not going to lead us to true happiness, might even hurt people along the way and use people along the way. Those pleasures, how do we differentiate between those pleasures and pleasures that might be more good and wholesome? For Aristotle, it's going to be your minds, your reasoning, and training that reasoning to be able to differentiate between the two. Well, and this is where we get to his virtue ethics. One of the main ways that we're going to do this is through the use of virtue. So using our mind and our reason to create the proper dispositions or actions that are going to help us differentiate between good pleasures and bad pleasures in order to attain perfect happiness, the ultimate good. So this is Aristotle's virtue theory. So virtues are a mean between two extremes. So you think of in mathematics, the mean of a set of numbers. So kind of the middle between two extremes. So that's important to note because that means any virtue, even though it's good, when we do too much or too little of something, it can still be bad. So if you think about maybe your most important qualities, they're good qualities because they're balanced. If you ended up going too much to one end and overusing certain qualities, that could be a bad thing. If you could also underutilize them, excuse me, that could also be a bad quality. So when Aristotle talks about virtue, he's talking about balance. And that's what we talk about when we say rightly ordered. It means they're balanced virtues. They're not either too much or too little when you use them, and they stay rightly ordered to get to our ultimate good. These two extremes Aristotle calls is excess, too much, and deficit, too little. Virtue in and of itself is ultimately a disposition, an ability, an openness, or in ultimately a habit whose aim at the intermediate condition in feeling and action. And there's going to be two sets of virtues of the body and virtues of the soul. So you might think of virtues of the body as virtues of character and virtues of the soul as virtues of thought. So thought is going to be equated to wisdom. And character, if you remember Socrates' conversation with Protagoras and Meno, is going to be equated to courage. So virtues of thought also refer to in your text longer in Lawhead as intellectual virtues. This is also what's going to be referred to in some of the later books in Aristotle. These intellectual virtues, or virtues of thought, are developed by teaching. In other words, we can learn them. They can be taught. Virtues of character or courage, what Lawhead refers to as moral virtues, are virtues that are developed by habit. So by doing them more often, we become more open to be able to do that virtue. Like if you think of like an athlete practicing, right? If he practices his shot in basketball, his jump shot, when he gets in that situation in the game, it's going to be like muscle memory. He'll know how to take that shot more easily. Similarly, virtues of character or moral virtues, the more that we practice them, the more that we make them a habit, the more that when we're just living life, we're probably going to act that way. And then we might be said we have a virtuous character. Our general disposition will already be oriented towards acting in these ways. As opposed to virtues of thought, intellectual virtues, they're going to be more here in our mind. So again, think of it this way. So virtue is a disposition of reason and of habit that exists in the middle of an extreme and of a deficit, an excess and a deficit. And this whole explanation, rightly ordered virtues, dispositions and habit, rational and habit, that exist as the rightly ordered mean between deficit and excess, that's essentially Aristotle's virtue theory, is all of that there's a theory that that's how virtue exists. And how do we attain that virtue? So you'll see here on the left kind of a chart of what Aristotle talks about. So this first one, courage. So courage is considered a virtue. It's going to be considered a virtue of character, or a moral virtue, a habit that we develop. It is a rightly ordered mean between having too little courage, what he would call cowardice, being a coward, or having too much courage, rashness. In other words, just kind of acting without any thought, jumping into a situation without actually thinking it through. That's rashness. So you can see probably in your own life, there's been times where you've been afraid to act, and there's been other times where you might have acted too quickly and didn't think it through and made a mistake because of that. For Aristotle, he would say that you either acted in the time that you were afraid to act in the deficit of the virtue of courage, or when you acted too rashly, you acted too quickly and made a mistake because of it, he would say you made the mistake because you acted in excess of the virtue of courage. And so our virtue ethics is essentially, all right, in those moments of rashness, in those moments of cowardice, how do we reorder the way we act to be closer to the middle, to be closer to actual courage, where we're not afraid to act, but we also act with reason, and we act with a strategy towards being happy Why? If we act too rashly, without any thought, that's probably not going to gain us happiness because we'll probably make a mistake or hurt someone by acting too rashly. We might miss the mark. If we act out of cowardice and we don't take an action, then we'll never attain happiness because we're too afraid to move, too afraid to make a decision. So again, it's about rightly ordering our actions. How do we move away from the two extremes to the middle of being courageous? That would be an example of Aristotle's virtue theory. Virtuous character, so someone who acts and lives virtue, is constituted by a habit of virtuous acts. So very simply put, you can be considered to have virtuous character if you have the habit of using virtue all the time, not excess, not deficit. And the more that you use virtue, rightly ordered, the more that you're considered virtuous, the more that you're hopefully attaining the ultimate good of happiness. Virtue must be done voluntarily. So someone cannot force someone to act in virtue. So even if I force you against your will to do something good, that would not be virtuous because you need to choose it. You cannot be forced to do virtue. You have to choose to do something virtuous. You have to choose to be courageous. And involuntary acts, so there's two different ways of maybe acting virtue against reason. So one on end, a non-voluntary act done out of ignorance. So you're courageous, not because you chose to be, but just in the moment. I don't know. But anyway, basically an example of when you don't choose something, it's done out of ignorance. You were patient by accident. An involuntary act where you think it through and you are either forced or you actively are choosing against it. But if you're an involuntary act would be an example of being forced, which usually, you're doing virtue out of pain or force. These two examples are against how we should be acting virtuously. Again, we should be willfully choosing it out of reason, and we shouldn't be forced to do it. It requires a choice. So virtues and vices. So vices, so when we talked about courage, cowardice is one end of an extreme, rashness another an extreme. These are forms of vices. In a similar manner, the opposite of courage is a vice. That could be another way of looking at it. So virtue is the rightly ordered mean. The extremes are vices. And both are chosen or developed into habit over choice. So another example, so I already used example, courage, rashness, and cowardice. So let's use another example. So temperance. The deficiency of temperance would be insensibility, not having any sense of what right action is. The excess of temperance is licentiousness, is I'm going to do whatever I want. Temperance is being right level-headed, right? You're making a rational choice, you're thinking it through. Licentiousness is saying I'm going to do whatever I want. Who cares what anyone tells me? That would be an excess of making an action but actually thinking it through. To continue the example I had given of courage, if you think back to the conversation between Socrates and Meno, and they talked about the example of or Protagoras, of the back and forth between cowardice and courage and going off to war, and that for Socrates, it was really the difference between courage and cowardice was missing the mark, a miscalculation of pleasure versus pain. So the brave person does not run into every battle. However, a brave person is not paralyzed by any possible danger. So he's going to think through which are going to be the right fights for me to actual fight, but he's not going to say, I'm not going to fight at all. So to not fight at all would be cowardice. To just say, I'm going to fight every fight and not care if I'm going to lose is rashness. Thinking it through and deciding which battles to actually fight is courage and actually fighting them. And the brave person stands firm against the right things and fears the right things. Another example would be wittiness, for instance. So boorishness is exactly that. You're kind of boring person. You don't really have any great intellectual thought or can't hold a conversation. Buffoonery, you just talk too much, you have word vomit, like I do sometimes, and you don't really make sense and you kind of just talk for the sake of talking. So you see the two extremes, talking too much for the sake of talking and just saying dumb things, boorishness, not really saying anything at all, and kind of not knowing how to say anything. And wittiness is in the middle. Someone who is bright can say something really clever, but is also intentional in what they say. So again, deficiency, excess, being in the middle is what we strive for. So that, in general, is a synopsis of Aristotle and his virtue ethics. And so now, we'll invite you to move on to the module assignments. But remember, ultimate good is happiness. Virtue ethics is seeking the right disposition, the right habits of virtues that are a mean between an excess and a deficit. And when we can live that life of virtue, those right ordered means of habits, both of the mind and of action, then we can get closer to attaining the ultimate good of happiness.